Okay, it's past noon, so good afternoon, and thank you for coming. And thanks also for those watching the live stream. For those of you who don't know, I'm Luigi Zingales. I'm the faculty director at the Stigler Center, and we're very happy to today Paul Tucker for a two-day mini course on the international economic order and the fractured geopolitics, and featuring topics from his newly released book entitled Global Discord, Values and Power in a Fractured World Order. Thank you, Paul, for joining us. And the book is available for sale outside the classroom, and Paul will be able to sign after the event. Today's topic is geopolitics, value, and international regime change for trade and investment. And tomorrow's lecture will be on interaction between security and international monetary and financial system. Before we start, please note that we are on the record and live streaming, so please silence your phones, but feel free to use social media. As usual, the views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center, let alone of the University of Chicago. As you may know, the Stigler Center promotes and diffuses research on regulatory capture and various distortions that special interest groups impose on capitalism. We have many initiatives, including our podcast, Capital Agents, co-hosted with Bethany McLean and myself, and our online publication, Roma. So please check them out. Back to this afternoon, we look forward to hearing Paul's insights, and he will answer the question at the end. His full bio is on our website, but before we begin, please allow me to introduce him briefly. He's currently the research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and the senior fellow at the Harvard Center for European Studies. He's also a director at Swiss Re and president of the UK National Institute for Economic and Social Research. Tucker spent over 3 decades in central banking, occupying senior position in international policymaking, and he was knighted by Britain in 2014. Among others, he was the chair of the Systemic Risk Council, the independent body of former top central bankers, official and expert dedicated to a stable financial system. As deputy governor at the Bank of England from 2009 to 2013, he was at the center of efforts to contain the financial crisis and to reshape the international regulatory framework for financial stability. He also served as a director at the Bank of International Settlements and on the steering committee of the G20 Financial Stability Board, among others. His previous book is on central banking, the state and democracy, and we hosted him for a mini course on it as well in 2018. So the videos are available on the Stigler Center website if you're interested. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sir Paul Tucker.
Luigi, thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much to your team for getting me here. I've got, since Luigi did it twice, I've got one request. When we get the Q&A, call me Paul or Tucker, but not the service. The United States is such a polite place. When I say that to Americans, they say, what do they call you in Britain? And I say, you? That actually sums up quite a lot of difference. So this is a school of yeah. This is a school of management, a business school, and so you might reasonably wonder why on earth Luigi has organized a mini course on geopolitics. I think it's fair to say that for most of the past 25, 30, 40 years, perhaps since the 1970s, it's been possible to come to a business school, go out into the business world, or to a public policy school and out into the policy world without thinking very much about international affairs. For those of you that find yourself running businesses over the next 10, 20 years, that is not what your life is going to be like. And if there's one simple reason for that, it's that commerce of all kinds, certainly international commerce, depends upon peace between nations and great confidence that there will be sustained peace between nations. And we don't have to fall into the depths of a horrible superpower war, although I think we could, in order for the superpower contest to dislocate the lives of businessmen and businesswomen, people that lead them and the people that work in them. This is hardly surprising, and the initial comment I'm going to make isn't normative at all. The world in which we all work, trade, make policy or whatever, travel as tourists, this is a world built after the Second World War under an American security umbrella. Pretty well all international cooperation, even regional cooperation, EU in Europe, ASEAN in Southeast Asia, it works under the umbrella of the peaceful coexistence leadership has provided. It's hardly surprising that a new rising superpower, one that hasn't had to shelter under the American security umbrella, should aspire to change the rules of the game, both at the level of peace and war, if you like, and at the level of individual regimes. What this could mean, and this thought first came to me while I was in Malaysia a few years ago, watching the ships go by, the big ships across the Straits of Malacca. International trade would be completely disrupted if the laws of the sea were no longer recognized by all the major powers. Trade has already been dislocated up to a point by the eroding authority of the World Trade Organization. So I'll have something to say about that. I'm going to make some sweeping headlines. This is not a careful presentation of the book to a kind of scholarly audience. It's a presentation to a business school audience. How long do I think this contest between China and the West will go on? I think it will be a long century. I don't think that the best comparators are the Second Reich and my country at the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century. For sure, that had the characteristic of a rising power and an established power clashing, but there weren't fundamentally rival views of how states and international relations in the world should be organized. It was more a struggle for spoils rather than a struggle for ways of life. I think a better comparator is Britain and France in the long 18th century, from roughly 1689 to roughly 1815. This was a contest that was everywhere, coasts of India, Southeast Asia, Africa, here, whether one thinks of it as the Revolutionary War or the War of Independence. This is, in some sense, it's an episode in the far bigger struggle between the United Kingdom and Paris, and in everything, certainly including commerce. It went so long, there were moments of rapprochement. There was an incredibly important trade deals signed in the middle of the 18th century, and then they fell out and didn't get to that point again until something like the 1860s, roughly 100 years later. This means China's in the news today and yesterday. There are kind of gleeful headlines all over the Western world. Is Xi going to be toppled? Will there be social and political dislocation in China? In terms of how I look at things, even were that to be the case, which I could say something about later if you wish, I don't think it will affect anything very much on my big picture view that this will last for a century. China has the critical mass. It's sufficiently advanced in pretty well everything that it is going to be a meaningful part of the global order for decades to come. And it doesn't particularly like the order system that it inherits from the world. Something I won't say very much about, although it's a bit topical in this university, the standard ways of thinking about international relations. It's as though if you sign up to be an international relations scholar, there's a mysterious moment when you're called to a special meeting and allocated to one of three tribes, either the Hobbesian realist tribe, or the Kantian idealist tribe, or the Grotian natural law rationalist tribe. A good deal of the book is about this. I don't find any, part of the problem with this is that if you're a Hobbesian, you talk about power all the time. If you're a Grotian, you talk about economic cooperation all the time. You might want to talk about all of them all of the time. And so the book's guiding spirit is a man called David Hume, who I'm confident is still taught in Chicago and in some departments. Some more headlines. Will the dollar survive as the premier world currency? The most important thing to say is we need it to. I'll explain why tomorrow. Will the WTO, the World Trade Organization, reestablish its authority? Probably not. Does Western financial policy matter to world order? Absolutely, definitely. One headline around that, which I'll expand on tomorrow, is the West cannot afford another global financial crisis. The book has, and actually I see, 4 scenarios for the coming decades. This is, apart from the last one, this isn't for a century. This is for kind of a relatively short period, 25, 30 years. So shorter, when I say short, I mean that seriously. That is shorter than a serious career in public service. So think about the length of time that President Biden was in the Senate, or my 33 years as a central banker. Over that kind of period, I think we have 4 scenarios. One is a lingering status quo. The second is a superpower struggle. Third is a new Cold War. And the fourth is a new world order, a reshaped world order. I started writing this book in around 2018, just as the previous one was coming out. We were then kind of generally between a lingering status quo and superpower struggle. I think the lingering status quo is where we are and will remain for a while in monetary and financial affairs, because the inertial value of being the incumbent reserve currency is so enormous that that's difficult to displace. I think for almost everything else, we are now between superpower struggle and the Cold War. And I think that's where we will stay for a long time. I think New World Order is out there somewhere. My own best hunch is that we won't have a New World Order until other great states with proud civilizational histories have arisen, most obviously India, but also Indonesia and possibly others. So those remarks span both today and tomorrow. What I want to do now is make a few remarks to drill down eventually into trade and investment. And in particular, I'll have a story to tell about trade. So the international relations realists, I always give them a capital R. I'm a realist, but of a slightly different stripe. Their basic thing is states care about their own survival. And kind of caricaturing them somewhat, this is just too much of a sweeping generalization. States are assemblies somehow of people and organizations, political relationships. If the leaders of state can't carry their people, if the people don't care very much about the survival of their state, the state won't put up a very good job of fighting for survival. After I'd finished the book, I realized that a really good example of this is interwar France. There are two in 20th century interwar France. An extraordinary thing about French political society and civil society is it was kind of more or less falling apart between the First World War and the Second World War. And with Prime Minister being dragged out of his car and people tried to assassinate him, Prime Minister Blum, and lots of other things like that. And this probably goes some way to explain, not necessarily why the Germans were able to smash the French army out of the way at the beginning of the Second World War, but it may go some way to explain how much collaboration there was, both in Vichy France and in northern France during that period, because people weren't holding on to the value of their own state in the way that we would typically associate with a peaceful, successful state. So what we fight for, or what we value, isn't just our own state, it's our way of life. And as soon as you think about it like that, values have been brought in alongside power. For sure, power matters, but the underlying theme of the book is that the values that legitimate our way of life, or the values that legitimate India's political way of life, or China's political way of life, or older historical states and empires' way of life, that these things matter. In terms of I want to make a contrast between how we think about ourselves, which you all know, so I'm not going to rehearse, and how China thinks about us. So at this point, I do something that sometimes irritates people. I hope you're not irritated. Who has heard of Document 9 from China? Okay, Document 9 was leaked by the Central Committee sometime in 2013. It was a document that had been sent from the highest party organs to universities, schools, media organizations, state-owned enterprises, absolutely everything. It's an incredibly important document. And if I didn't know about it until writing this book, I would encourage you to go and find it on the web and to read it. It's not very long, but it has in it the 7 no's, and they are known as the 7 no's. And I'm going to rehearse some of them. No to promoting constitutional democracy or universal values. No to civil society, meaning individual rights, challenging the party's social foundation and its leadership of the masses. No to neoliberalism, meaning total marketization. No to the Western idea of journalism by freedom of the press. It is contrary to party discipline. No to historical nihilism against the history of the party in New China. And then a different kind of no. No to any questioning of the socialist nature of socialism with Chinese characteristics. I think the inclusion of the last one actually is really a good thing, but less grist to my mill. Kind of around the same time, Chinese leaders were making speeches, important speeches, about how Chinese law was kind of subordinate to the party, that you couldn't say that the constitution sat above the party sat above and embodied the constitution of socialism with Chinese values. And what that was asserting in turn was that this is a unitary structure reaching up to a pinnacle of power, the leader of the party. Kind of oddly, I call Leader Xi throughout the book with a capital L, which was actually before he had declared himself constitutionally to be Leader Xi. So at least I foresaw that. This kind of hierarchy leading to one source of authority is not unique. In Western Eurasian history, that's true of the Byzantine Empire. It isn't, of course, true of Western Europe. I've ended up thinking that in some ways, an experience of fractured power today embodied in what we call the separation of powers goes back much earlier to the split between the temporal power of the Holy Roman Emperor, the German Emperor, and the kind of temporal power in a different way of the Catholic Church from around 1000 AD. And the significance of that is, I think that we have come from a tradition where power is fractured. We regard it as normal, that power is fractured. We don't, we would feel uncomfortable if one person was in charge of absolutely everything. That is not China's history. It was not Byzantium's history. It is not Tsarist Russia's history. None of this is normative. This is descriptive. We should expect civilizations with such different institutional histories to kind of meet each other with a certain degree of tension. that the book doesn't just argue at a kind of high plane, it has some guiding principles. One of them, this is if there is one canon of realism which we should hold on to, it is nothing about anarchy and struggles and rising powers. It's avoid wishful thinking. I will. People often think they find this in Thucydides. Thucydides doesn't actually say it, but he certainly implies it. And I'll say something about this in the context of trade in a moment. For the economists in the room, I think when facing something potentially really bad, the best approach to take is minimax, aim to minimize the maximum cost of bad states of the world without unnecessarily making those bad states of the world more likely. And related to that, try to design regimes that are resilient, which is bounce back under pressure. And part of the argument of the book is that what legitimacy does is that it makes states, associations of states, international organizations, kind of more resilient than they would otherwise be. Now, the book has a good deal to say about what does that mean for the design of international organizations and international regimes. I'm going to pick out just two things, which are different sides of the same thing. The first is that do not set up international regimes in a way that arm's length judges will end up being the high policymakers, that they will end up being in charge. And the second is that if they find themselves in that position, they should exercise great self-restraint. So let me now get to the WTO. Who knows about the state-owned enterprises subsidies case from around 2011, 12? This is a fantastically important case. So China has all these state-owned enterprises, absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. So does the United States, although it pretends it doesn't. Fannie and Freddie, which subsidize your mortgages, they are state-owned enterprises. We Europeans think that's all slightly odd to have organizations like that or not have universal healthcare. Americans think it's all the other way around. The world has differences, that's fine. China has lots of state-owned enterprises. It also has quite a few private businesses these days. The state-owned enterprises, going back to the 90s into the zeros, were offering extensive subsidies to other businesses exporting into the rest of the world, including the United States. Such subsidies are pro tanto illegal under the WTO rules, except in certain circumstances. Where a state introduces illegal subsidies, they should either withdraw them, or those on the suffering from them, if you like, are entitled to employ what are countervailing measures. This is not very complicated. You just introduce a tariff that offsets the value of the subsidy, and you arrive back to the position, you arrive back at the pre-subsidy price. That's the idea. You're only allowed to put those tariffs in place if indeed the subsidies are illegal. China's state-owned enterprises extend these subsidies. The United States wants to put countervailing measures in place. China says, no. The United States can't do that because their subsidies are not illegal. So it goes to China bring a case against the United States, which goes to the WTO through the dispute panel up to the top body, which is the appellate body. The case turns on whether state-owned enterprises are, quote, a public body as defined or as the terms are used in the WTO treaty, and the appellate board decides that they are not, because the state-owned enterprises crudely aren't policy bodies. Now, in one sense, this is completely crazy, Because, of course, if you live in a state-controlled state like China, everything up to a point, greater or lesser extent, is an emanation of the state. And if the central party machinery wants state-owned enterprises to introduce subsidies for exports, they will introduce subsidies for exports. They won't say, no, go and take a running jump. We're not going to do that. So the case is decided that way, and everyone in Washington is frightfully fed up. And had the appellate board decided the other way, people in Beijing would have been frightfully fed up. So the first thing I want to say, this is not the most important thing. First thing I want to say is this is an appellate board out of its depth. It's not just deciding a little trade dispute or a trade dispute between the United States and the EU. Lots of WTO cases are about the US versus the EU. Two big blocks, all part of the same security umbrella, NATO, et cetera, et cetera. It's not like that. This is, my goodness, they're going to be allowed to carry on subsidizing, Beijing are going to be allowed to carry on subsidizing exports. That's going to damage our country. That's going to damage our political welfare. That's going to damage political stability in our country. This is a kind of bad thing with ramifications going well beyond the standard EU versus Washington struggle, which themselves are quite pointed, but just not as pointed. So the judges are out of their depth. It's rather like, forgive me for saying this, it's rather like the way that the Supreme Court here quite often finds itself out of its depth, not just recently with decisions that probably most people in this room don't like, but throughout my adult lifetime, I thought, I don't know what they're doing when they decide that. They don't know where that's campaign finance. They will have had no idea where that was going to lead. I mean, I've been in a position where you think, ooh, better, this is not for us. This is kind of for the Prime Minister or for Parliament or something. But rather like the Supreme Court here, the appellate board is trapped in being the final decision taker. Now, you might say, particularly any of you that come from a parliamentary background, it's one thing deciding a backward-looking case. That doesn't decide forward-looking policy. Just change the policy. Get China and Washington around the table, maybe with the EU and Japan, and they can reach some kind of bargain. A bit less subsidy, bit of countervailing measures, write down some kind of rule that encapsulates that. I wouldn't be able to do that, but I know people who would be able to do it. Tell the world that's the agreement that's been reached. That's a safer way for trade to carry on into the future. So that's effectively bringing diplomacy, the bargaining table, back into world trade. Not possible. It's not possible because unlike the GATT, the WTO gives everybody a veto. So this is the point to absorb. So because everyone has a veto, it's basically impossible to change anything. Because it's almost impossible to change anything, that means the original drafters of it, kind of implicitly, I'm sure not consciously, had the conceit that they were writing down the perfect trade agreement for the rest of the history of the world or something. Or alternatively, they're not mutually exclusive, that any cases that did end up at the appellate board wouldn't have huge stakes, because after all, it was a kind of liberal world and everyone was moving towards some kind of political liberalism through some kind of economic liberalism. And that, of course, is utterly naive. It's a fantastic example of wishful thinking. It's also a fantastic example of a silo, in this case, trade negotiators, who are a tough bunch, much tougher than the policy world I lived in, not really thinking ahead to what the world might look like in 25 or 30 years time. And there's another extraordinary element of wishful thinking, or kind of blinkers in a way is more than wishful thinking. So two of the things I've read about this case, the case has all sorts of extraordinary things, including just minor things like the American judge on the appellate board isn't actually involved in the case, but all of the judges go to a kind of broader case meeting where they're allowed to kind of input their views on the arguments, except she can't attend the meeting because she's having a meeting with the American ambassador who's telling her that the Obama administration is not going to renew her on the appellate board. This is absolutely remarkable. This is completely incompetent, but it's not as incompetent as the next thing, if it's true. I've read two things saying it's true, which is that when they presented their case, the US-American trade negotiators didn't say, well, of course, it's not a public body in the kind of sense that would be recognizable in Britain or Germany or Mexico for that matter, but this is a party state, and what matters is the Communist Party. There are no submissions on the role of the party. This is a bit like going back to my Britain-France thing, the beginning of the 18th century. This is a bit thinking about what Britain's going to do, and you don't bother to think about Louis XIV or something. I mean, it's just kind of really strange. And since I'm sure the men and women involved are incredibly accomplished, this is not ad hominem or ad feminem criticism of them. It's a criticism of silos in a world that can no longer sustain silos, because peaceful coexistence can't be taken for granted. Now, it's not easy to see how to get out of this. So imagine that there was a proposal to reduce the scope of member states' veto powers in the WTO, which would probably be a good thing. That, of course, is itself subject to a veto. So it's not going to happen. And this is one of the, it's not the only, but it's one of the reasons that regional trade agreements, so-called preferential trade agreements, are becoming the place where trade policy is played out. And it's also a reason why the Trump administration pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, which is such an extraordinary thing to do. Again, another incompetent thing to do, because this essentially was going to be a trade agreement crossing the Pacific, where state subsidies would not be permitted from state-owned enterprises. Let me ask another question. Who has heard of bilateral investment treaties? Who? 3, 4, 5, 6. Have you? So nor had I when I started working on this book. This is absolutely extraordinary. The world I've just been describing, the world of trade, is a world where there's a big multilateral treaty, there's an organization with a building, there's a judicial process, there's an assembly, although the assembly, as I said, is subject to veto. When you get the bilateral investment treaties, they are bilateral, because going back to the 1940s, people didn't succeed in their wish at the time to get a multilateral treaty for cross-border investment. That very law covering this goes back centuries and centuries into customary international law. The way to think about it is, if you invest in my country, there was a customary norm that was regarded as a binding law among states, that I wouldn't just grab your assets. Or in particular, I wouldn't, in doing so, I didn't discriminate against you as opposed to investors from my own country. That's very old. After the Second World War, partly led by Germany, partly because it needed to overcome the sins, the horrors of its past, the customary law norms started to become codified into bilateral investment treaties. And a really important thing about them is that I'm a British state, you're a company. If I do discriminate against you, or you think I've discriminated against you, you bring the case and we go to arbitration, not your state. So this is, whereas WTO, state versus state, going through a court system, this is company versus state, going through an arbitration system. And the history of international law, particularly the modern world, is often a history of arbitration leading later on into adjudication. The Hague Tribunal for arbitration, which was set up at the turn of the 20th century, existed before the International Court that was created in the League of Nations, and then as an offshoot of the United Nations. So there's lots of frustration with BITS. It's opaque. There's no, unlike a court system, including the WTO court system, there's no one panel. It's not a permanent panel of judges. It's a shifting population of arbitrators. There are some perceptions that some of them have conflicts of interest. Some states object to there being company to host arbitrations, adjudication, state to state. I'm going to get the details wrong, but I think Brazil and India may have withdrawn from their treaties and rewritten some of them. I think that Brazil may never have participated in this in a fully fledged way. There are thousands and thousands of these treaties. And all the big countries have a model treaty that they use. And the frustrations with this have led to demands for a WTO type body. That this is illegitimate, they'll say, all these problems with the existing system. We need something that's more transparent, fairer, where we can see what's going on. Problem is, of course, that in my own view, and I think the view of others, given where the WTO system has ended up, it's not necessarily sensible to recreate exactly the same structural problems of a universal treaty with vetoes in this field. Meanwhile, something massive has been occurring. There are exceptions in all of these treaties for national security and things like national security. Those are now being used. They've always been used a bit. Those are now being used in earnest. And of course, it's partly the Western states using those restrictions or gateways against China and the other way round. What we haven't yet seen, but I think could see, is the kind of machinery that we had during the old Cold War. So all of the main Western states, and probably the small ones as well, had provisions of this kind to protect against inward investment from the Soviet Union, and also to control the export of sensitive technology into the Soviet Union. That creates a coordination problem. Luigi's Italy decides not to export something with a certain valuable technology, decides not to. Britain, meanwhile, decides to do so. Well, since the technology is just as valuable if it comes from Britain as if it comes from Italy, we've got a coordination problem. That happened in Vienna through an organization called COCOM. And the point of mentioning it is it's a kind of Cold War type piece of apparatus where you want to be consistent across policies. And you see this in the newspapers. The EU is doing this, America is doing that. They've got to get their act together, and which means that they'll eventually have to find some machinery for doing it. And the challenge, I mean, this is going back to my scenarios, this is where you live between superpower struggle and new Cold War, is it makes sense. It makes sense for China as well to be much more careful about what is exported and what is imported, so as not to have over-dependence where it matters. This is kind of the geopolitical version of moving from just in time to just in case, except the just in case is just in case we're not able to defend ourselves or look after our people in really, really bad states of the world, however remote, almost however remote they are. And it's how do you pursue that decoupling without going headlong into the kind of protectionism that undermined the world in the 1930s, undermined it economically, and undermined it politically because it aggravated the tensions between states rather than smoothing the tensions among states. So kind of one personal thing I feel about this is, well, much easier to be a policymaker when I was, which was 2002 until 2013 than now. The stakes are much higher now. And I'll finish today on one note which bridges to tomorrow. During the financial crisis, so this is 2009, 10 maybe, conceivably late 2008, but I don't think so. Somebody walks into my office, I'm Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, and says, the Federal Reserve has just refused India a swap line. You don't need to know in any detail what a swap line is. It's just a line of credit from the Federal Reserve against collateral of the currency of the borrowing country. So the United States and the UK has a swap line. We can borrow dollars. We give them sterling as collateral. I guess my team signed that agreement. So this person coming into my room, the Federal Reserve has just refused India a swap line. And my response was, this is the first sentence of the preface of the book. Don't they realize India's going to be a power? It was God. We've got a whole century ahead of us. India's going to be, why on earth would you aggravate Delhi over something so small? Luigi was kind enough to mention my previous book, which is about how unelected power holders like central bankers should stick to their remit and not go playing in things like, if you like, climate change and social justice or geopolitics. So how does that fit together? I'm suddenly saying the Federal Reserve should have weighed geopolitics. Well, not quite. I think what they should have done was recognize that they were out of their depth. And this was for the president to decide after consulting people in Congress. And the Federal Reserve could say no, but the US Treasury could have said yes, with the Federal Reserve funding the US Treasury. That my generation lived in a simple world. There are people sitting around the room who are roughly the same generation as me. Those of you, the main body of people in the room, you live in a much more complicated world, more dangerous in some respects, but certainly more complicated. You will have to weigh things that my generation escaped, and we were lucky to do so. The burden you face is much greater, even in apparently mundane things like trade policy, cross-border investment policy, and monetary policy. Thank you very much. 12:45. I think questions are allowed.
Yeah, questions are allowed, and there are microphones. So raise your hands, and we take you the microphone, and you can ask the question. So people, there's a question over there. Okay.
Just to say, I'm not a University of Chicago student, so any comments, questions not reflective of the quality of university.
So maybe I would like to have how you elaborate a little bit about the last sentence, the last bullet point about globalization. So I've been working on cross-border between US and China, mainly in a variety of different industries. I've also been in the US for a long time. I've never imagined the relationship with China and this. Like when you said lingering, I'm worried about wars, right?
Yes. Yes.
So I wanted to, for example, the CHIP Act, there's all of these elements of what US is taking against China makes me very worried. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and also your comments about, you've been assuming you have history in UK, how are the EU are really bonding with the US to isolate China?
This is a great series of questions. In a sense, the sentiment of the book is I'm not going to get this quite right. Yeah, I kind of see why you're surprised, but I don't want you to be surprised because that's what the world is like when it's like this. It's the last time it was like this, I think, was a bit like this, was in the early 1970s, Vietnam War, proxy war in a way, collapse of Bretton Woods, Watergate, everything falling apart. People in the United States get in a frenzy about the rise of Germany and Japan, completely unnecessary frenzy as it happens. But it was a period where the book is dedicated, one of the two people the book's dedicated to is Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker, famous Fed leader, but actually was in the US Treasury. I think he was the Undersecretary for International Affairs during the period I'm describing. And I was lucky enough to know Paul pretty well. And he talked about international affairs much more comfortably than any of his successors. Not because he was a better person. I mean, I think he probably was actually, but not because he was a better person, but because that was what he had had to live through. I mean, this is what, I mean, the story of my country and France reaching a trade agreement and then going off the trade agreement, and they don't quite get there again until about 1860, is remarkable. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is I think one way of thinking about the war in and on Ukraine is as the first proxy war. I think it would have been not impossible, but harder for Putin to prosecute this war without the acquiescence of Beijing in the context of the firm friendship between Putin and Xi articulated some months before. For what it's worth, one of the few sentences I had to change in the book during may even have been proofreading was that I had thought that would happen if and when China made an aggressive move against Taiwan. I thought if China ever makes an aggressive move against Taiwan, Russia will move into Eastern Europe. The Western Alliance won't be prepared, it will be stretched. It is a bit stretched. There's a story in newspapers this morning about concerns about arms going to Taiwan more slowly because of how much is going to Ukraine. I think Putin has given away that optionality. I mean, if I was Beijing, I'd be really irritated with Putin, really irritated, because he has given away a precious bit of optionality. He also hasn't done very well, which is kind of a different thing in a way. I think things like that will be going on for it's here we are sitting in Chicago. I think most weeks you should, I've thought this for about 7 or 8 years. I think most weeks you should just check out what's going on in the South China Sea. Just follow what's going on in the South China Sea may be the most important thing going on in the world for you. For what it's worth, I think the most important thing that happened in 2020 was not the plague, not COVID, which is a remarkable thing to say, because that was plainly a gigantic thing to happen. I think in history, the most important thing to happen in 2020 was the border skirmish between Chinese troops and India troops, with China going over into what India claims is its territory. And that led shortly afterwards to India wanting to revive the Pacific Quad, which had been a Japanese initiative 10, 15 years before that had gone into abeyance. These were the kind of things that, you know, if you were someone like me or someone like you, didn't need to take any notice of this kind of thing. But now I think we do, without being overwhelmed by it and without hurtling towards, we need to be very careful not to make a serious conflict inevitable. And I suppose I should have said this, it's said at the beginning of the book. the book is kind of pluralist liberal in a sense. I mean, I think it's wonderful that so many people in China have got out of poverty. I think it's wonderful that people in the West know more about Chinese civilization. This isn't about Chinese people or about Confucian heritage, but it is partly about an ideology of unitary control. I do think it's partly about that.
I'll try not to be that person who says I don't need a mic. I'm using the mic. So I'm a Booth student. Hopefully this reflects well on the community. Thinking about India, you mentioned the anecdote from the financial crisis. What do you, I guess, expect India to do, and how do you expect India to comport itself within the world order in the next whatever time frame you'd like to talk about? And if you were, say, the British ambassador to India, what would you encourage them to do? Knowing that today, one thing India likes to do in its own self-interest is kind of play a couple of different groups off each other, right? Join the Quad with Japan, America, et cetera. And on the other hand, go ahead and buy Russian grain and things like that. Yeah, what would you expect?
India has a proud tradition of non-alignment after its independence, liberation from the shackles of the British Empire. And were one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement in the 50s and 60s, which didn't get very far in terms of reorganizing the world economic order, which I think is a good thing, but kind of steadfastly stick to that. And I think we should expect nothing else. I should think we should expect nothing else of a country or people who have a conception of their own place in history and the world. A complicated one for sure, because India itself, as I'm sure you know, its governing traditions are a kind of blend of Sanskrit, the Brahminate tradition, and the kind of more Persian governance traditions that were brought down by the Delhi Sultanate and later by the Mughals and others. And I think a really important thing for India, for us, over the next 20, 30 years, is how stable it will be, given the sectional strife in India is probably as high over recent years as it has been during my lifetime. So my advice to British ambassador would be, don't expect them to be a kind of firm ally. Be careful how you speak. Don't alienate them. Be as interested in their great civilization as we used to be.
So my question is, do United States really want to defeat Russia?
I think the mic may not be on. It's fine for me, I can hear.
Okay.
Sorry to.
So do United States really want to defeat Russia in Ukraine war, or they afraid of it? Or they afraid to defeat Russia totally, expecting some bad consequences?
I guess their aims are for Russia to withdraw and to avoid this escalating much further, and to Ukraine find its way through the world as a state. That's not too bad. I mean, it's complicated, of course. I mean, Putin put out his essay on the history of the Ukraine, but it was a rather selective history of the Ukraine. There's a marvelous history of the Ukraine written by a man at Harvard. He only happens to be at Harvard. And even during the Mongol period in Central Asia, what is now southwest of Ukraine was part of a different Mongol province from the northeast of Ukraine. But the Ukrainian people have shown, in the east of Ukraine as well as in the west of Ukraine, have shown that they have a sense of being Ukrainian. They also have shown that they have a sense that they want to live and are prepared to die in order to live, which is, I think, actually the biggest challenge that will face the West. And I think that's what Germany is going through. But of course, what we'd like, I think myself, is we would like Russia to find a different place in the world, one where it was a bit less fragile, a bit less prickly, and therefore a bit less aggressive. I could say something else actually, which is, since I'm in Chicago, it's pity Luigi's gone. So Professor Mearsheimer here and others think it was a great mistake for NATO to expand into the East, and actually he and others thought that NATO both should be abolished after the end of the Cold War and would be abolished after the end of the Cold War. Now, what's interesting about, and that seems to me a perfectly kind of legitimate point of view, which one would argue in policy circles. But if you were taking the policy decision, you wouldn't follow that advice because of the wishful thinking part. What it says is we're going to put all of our chips, all of them, on Russia not being aggressive, and you wouldn't want to do that. So the realist response to the NATO question was to continue with NATO, not to abolish NATO, if we take the canonical principle of realism to being avoid wishful thinking.
Thank you. So, like my one particular question is, you said that India, Indonesia, and all they can be future powers. They might be future powers. Similar thing was said for a lot of countries before as well. Like Japan also called to be said to be the next superpower. Even Brazil was like a highlight for a very long time, but things haven't been the most smooth over there. What do you think would be the biggest challenges for these like upcoming superpowers, like as they actually head towards a power status now?
Sustaining economic growth, I guess by some combination of allowing private enterprise or the market to allocate resources without so disadvantaging some parts of the community that the community rebel. I don't think anyone can be a great power in the new world without a large population. I mean, some countries are going to be small and grow spectacularly, but they're going to be influential, but they're not going to be powers. It's the way I think about a power is you've grown sufficiently that you can, putting it very crudely, you can develop armed forces and security apparatus without that depleting the welfare of the people, the consumption of the people horribly. So you can obviously do that in a big economy much more easily than in an economy which is still quite small.
So, just with this logic, so where do you see Middle East going as a whole? Like a lot of things are happening. It's expanding on the outside, but it does feel that it is internally rupturing also, like things which are happening in Iran and all. And even like Qatar, to be honest.
Yes. I think I'd say two things about the Middle East. One about energy, which I'll come to, and one about Shia-Sunni tensions. I have no capacity to form judgments on how likely it is, the probability of Iran reforming in some crude way, liberalizing. I don't mean making it just like here or just like my country. But imagine it did sometime over the next 10, 15, 20 years. That would dislocate the Gulf's relations with the West in ways probably not seen since the 1950s or arguably the late 1970s. So I think that Gulf capitals are kind of making the judgment in the sense that Iran will stay as it is. Whereas if Iran changed, I think that the Gulf states have even more awkward judgments to make. Meanwhile, however great the commitment to solve climate change, we still live in a world where the stuff in the ground in the Gulf matters a lot. And we have seen that play out over the past few months. And I didn't find anything very surprising about that at all. I mean, not that it was inevitable, but it was plainly within a kind of reasonable probability distribution, and that remains their source of power. And I think their challenge is, and in different ways, MBZ and MBS, kind of this is their aim, is to get to a world where they are less dependent upon energy, but actually it's multidimensional. They need to get to a world where they're less dependent upon energy and are perceived by the different powers of the world as themselves comfortable friends, if not allies. There's a story about Saudi Arabia that I will tell tomorrow because it's about the extraordinary interweaving of geopolitics, monetary policy, and security policy. It's an amazing story, but I'm going to resist temptation and tell it tomorrow. We're out of time.